it's Deborah Poneman, founder of Yes to Success and Ageless Seminars. And today I am coming to you from beautiful Fairfield, Iowa. And I'm staying at the fabulous home of my friend Janet Atwood, founder of the Passion Test and Mastery of Self-Love. And I was needing some books to raise my computer. My daughter is a chiropractor, and she is adamant about me not getting computer neck, which you get when you are looking down at your computer. And she insists that I always have my computer at eye level. So, since it was time for me to create my Success Saturday, I went over to Janet's bookshelf to get some books to raise my computer. And one of the books that was on her shelf was one of my all-time favorites, Brene Brown's The Gift of Imperfection. And so I decided that I was going to talk to you about imperfection and perfection. So I'm going to start out with Brene Brown's definition of perfection, which goes like this. Perfectionism is a self-destructive and addictive belief system that fuels the thought, if I look perfect, live perfectly, and do everything perfectly, I can avoid or minimize the painful feelings of shame, judgment, and blame. And then Brene goes on to explain that perfectionism is self-destructive simply because there's no such thing as perfect. Perfection is an unattainable goal and is, in fact, really only about perception. We want to be perceived as perfect, but it's unattainable because it doesn't exist. And there's no way to control other people's perception of you, regardless of how much time and energy you spend trying. Perfectionism is addictive because when we do experience being judged or blamed or having feelings of shame, we often believe it's because we weren't perfect enough. So rather than questioning the faulty logic of perfectionism, or the faulty perception somebody might have of us, we become even more committed to our mission of living, looking, and doing everything just right. So how do we overcome perfectionism? Well, first, we need to be able to acknowledge our vulnerabilities and also to practice self-compassion. When we become more loving and compassionate with ourselves and we begin to practice what Brene calls shame resilience, we can embrace our imperfections. And it's in the process of embracing our imperfections that we find our truest gifts and create our most meaningful life and deepest relationships. But actually, let's take a step back for a minute because I want you to think about the difference between perfectionism and healthy striving. Healthy striving is simply wanting to do a good job for positive reasons and not because you believe that if you're perfect, you can avoid shame, blame, and judgment, all three of which we need to accept as realities of life. So when you find yourself, for example, rewriting the report or the article for the fourth time, ask yourself, am I just wanting to do a good job or am I trying to be perfect in order to avoid, again, shame, blame, and judgment? So you have to be honest with yourself. And if the answer is the latter, stop and accept good enough. Or you can always ask for help. It's that simple. You can, at that moment, also remind yourself that perfection does not exist. And no one is going to notice the difference between what you already did, which is probably excellent, and perfect. You can also remind yourself that the time and energy it takes to go from excellent to what you think is perfect is not worth your health or your relationships. Brene also believes that the need to be perfect is what kills creativity. How can you let creativity loose when you're afraid to make a mistake? It even kills risk taking for the same reason. If you take a risk, there's always the chance you won't appear perfect. But risk taking is what leads to the greatest entrepreneurial success. So here's a test for you to see if you fall in the category of a perfectionist. Give yourself a yes or a no for each of these points. Okay. I got to read them. They're over here. So I want you to give a yes or a no for each of these points. Number one, you feel compelled to be the best in everything you do, even if it's something you don't care much about. Yes or no? Next, you're hypercritical and highly conscious of your own and other people's mistakes. Guilty as charged. 3, you spend much of your time to perfect something, even at the expense of your health, well-being, and or relationships. Number 4, you set absolute ideals. There is only black and white, no gray. Number 5, you beat yourself up over the smallest things that go wrong. Number 6, you obsessively mull over outcomes and how you could have done things differently if they don't turn out as well as you had envisioned. Remember, give yourself yes or no. Number 7, you are hypersensitive and defensive towards criticism. Number 8, you are so obsessed about achieving your goal that you seldom, if ever, enjoy or even notice the journey. All right. So, how many yeses did you get? 1, 2, 8. Well, if it's more than 2, you can pretty much assume you have some work to do to free yourself from the self-destructive and addictive belief system that fuels the thought, if I look perfect, live perfectly, and do everything perfectly, I can avoid or minimize the painful feelings of shame, judgment, and blame. And then what I want you to do is to go back over the list and do the opposite. For example, try not to be so sensitive towards criticism, but instead realize it's just that person's perception. And actually, we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. So oftentimes somebody's shame, blame, or criticism has nothing to do with you. Or when something is already good enough, stop and spend the extra time loving up your partner or your kids or your doggy or watching a good movie or taking a nice walk or a warm bath. Or when something goes wrong, instead of beating yourself up because you weren't perfect enough, say, thank you, universe. Now I know what not to do next time. Glad it happened now and not later when the stakes could have been higher. In other words, spend the coming week watching yourself and noticing and letting go of the need to be perfect, because the opposite of perfection is not imperfection or mediocrity. The opposite of perfection is reality. So have a fabulously imperfect week, and I send you my love.